Good everyone, welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, we've had the latest labour market data for the September quarter come in. The unemployment rate has increased. It's now 4.8%. Not quite as bad as might have been expected. Market pick, the Reserve Bank's pick, in fact, was 5.0%. So not quite as bad. Some people are wondering, is the labour market actually that hit at all? But really, once you go beneath the surface, although the unemployment rate itself might not have increased all that much, the labour market's still looking pretty weak overall.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we've seen, as you say, the unemployment rate rise, but the reason it didn't lift as by as much as it might have been anticipated was a drop in participation by half a percentage point, which is just quite a significant drop, as particularly young people showing signs of being sort of more discouraged and dropping out of the labour market, not actively searching for work, maybe going back into study and that type of thing. What I thought was the key number coming out of all of that, though, was the employment result, where the total number of jobs was down 0.4% from a year ago, down 0.5% from the previous quarter. And that annual drop in employment is actually the first that we have seen since back following the global financial crisis, so in well over a decade. So there is real signs of weakness coming through there. We know that hiring tensions have been weak amongst businesses for several quarters. We've seen more recently, when we look at the monthly employment indicators and the sort of job numbers in there, that they have been tailing off through the course of 2024 as well. So it's quite nice, in a sense, to see consistency between the different employment indicators, because that's not always the case. But yeah, for me, that probably epitomised the general sort of weakness in the labour market that is there, and the fact that some people have dropped out of the labour market, keeping that participation rate down, keeping the unemployment rate lower than it might otherwise have been, is for me a bit of a secondary consideration. There is, signs of softness coming through right across the board as far as I'm concerned.
Totally. And I think what sort of really struck me when we looked through the numbers yesterday is that employment, the number of people in jobs, dropped by about 14,000 on a seasonally adjusted basis from a quarter before. Of those 14,000, only 5,000 went into unemployment, officially unemployed, looking for work, available for work. So that leaves about 9,000 people who are not looking for work or not available. And you're right, when we looked into some of those figures, you did have a lift in the number of people who are not in the labour force now. They're not counted as employed or unemployed, but they have not now gone back into formal study. And so there does seem to be a bit of a shift that we normally see as the labour market weakens, as people start to sort of think about reskilling, so that when the labour market does turn around, they've got skills to try and easier find a role in the future. Also interesting, a bit of a broadening out in that unemployment rate hit. Up until now, we've seen a lot of that unemployment rate hit concentrated on young people. That's still mostly the case, but it was interesting to see yesterday an uptick in the unemployment rate for most age groups between the ages of 40 and 60. And so again, just a little bit more of, again, businesses struggling to retain as many staff because they just don't have the amount of work on offer that they need to employ all those people. Other end of the spectrum that I thought was interesting was labour costs. We saw that those continued to moderate. The labour cost index was still up, I think 3.8% overall, but not quite as much of a slowdown as we might have expected. I think market picks were around sort of 3.5% odd. What did you sort of make of those numbers? Because I mean, there were a lot of moving parts. Your private sector numbers came back down quite a bit more, which I think was encouraging. Some of those public sector numbers still look quite elevated. When we looked through them last time, up until now, again, it's been health, payment agreements and what have you that have come through. In the September quarter, those had pulled back a bit because they've mostly flowed through or started already. There was a big boost though, and we sort of dug through the numbers. It turned out to be that the police settlement had now come in the September quarter. So again, sort of a few one-off hits coming through on the public sector pay numbers, but on overall, still a fair bit of sort of general moderation?
Yeah, I mean, moderation across both public and private sector, but probably more key for me is the private sector side of things, where I think the quarterly increase in labour costs was about 0.7%. And again, if you look back over the last 2 or 3 years, that is the softest result we've seen in a couple of years, possibly I think back to 2021. So signs that the labour market and wage costs are also performing largely as you would expect. The Reserve Bank won't be 100% comfortable with where things are sitting there, but they continue to head in the right direction. And we know that labour costs and the labour market more generally do tend to be quite a lagging indicator for the rest of the economy. So, for some workers, there will still be an element of catch up for them in terms of their wages, given the significant increases in living costs and prices right across the economy that we have seen over the last 2 or 3 years. Having said that, of course, most workers will be experiencing less bargaining power now, given that the sort of jobless rate is increasing. And, many people would rather take the choice of keeping your job rather than having, necessarily bargaining or for a bigger wage increase coming through as well. I think from the Reserve Bank's point of view, I mean, when we look back over the last 2 or 3 weeks, one of the key things for me was a speech by Adrian Orr where he talked about moving more incrementally on the way down. That's a little bit at odds with what we've actually seen so far, the 50-point cut coming through at the most recent review. But it did sort of start to put to bed any suggestions perhaps of a 75-point cut that we might have been anticipating coming through later this month. For me, looking at the numbers, and the market is still picking a 50-point cut, that's where they're aiming at. And I think these figures would tend to land more in that camp as well. Just still the odd element of concern there, but an expectation going forward that some of those business cost pressures, labour cost pressures, do continue to ease. There's a little bit of persistence there, but looking forward into 2025, we'd expect to see labour costs continuing to moderate as a reflection of the continued weakness or further weakness in the labour market over the next 6 to 9 months or so.
And that's why I think, when we saw the labour market results yesterday at a very headline surface only level with the unemployment rate not increasing as much as expected, labour costs sort of not falling back perhaps as quickly as expected, I think immediately that put the kibosh on the idea of a 75 basis point increase. At the same time, there was a sort of part of me that went, geez, is that labour market data sort of so not as bad as expected as to actually sort of flip between 25 and 50. But I think given the labour market, one, always moves with a lag, and two, jobs were definitely down. It's just that maybe it's not coming through in the normal or as directly into the unemployment rate as we might have expected. But more importantly, all of that other weaker economic data we've seen over time, spending is still not great. Job numbers advertised out there in the market are still down. Still not a huge amount of great economic trends starting to come through, all combined to, like I say, landing on 50. Do still wonder if the Reserve Bank should and might toss up between any three options of 25, 50 or 75 and sort of coalesce around that central area of 50. I would sort of like them to tease that out a bit more, because you're right, the governor has talked a lot, about more incremental steps. That sort of came, I think it was like a week, maybe 2 weeks after deciding to sort of up the ante to 50. And so again, just trying to figure out what is an incremental step to the Reserve Bank. Is that normal incremental of 25, or is 50 the new 25 and the new normal, at least on the downside for now? We'll assess how all of that goes, including the next update from the Reserve Bank later in November, all the other economic data, and what else is happening in the economy in the lead up to Christmas on one of our next editions of Econ Talks.